It's not just the NSA crisis or scandal that's shadowing Silicon Valley at the moment. It seems as if more and more people around the world, and particularly outside Silicon Valley in America, are noting the growing disparities of wealth and power between Silicon Valley and the rest of the country. The guy who's done most, I think, to bring this issue to the broader public attention is a writer and journalist called George Packer. George is a staff member at The New Yorker. He's the author of an extremely good new book called The Unwinding, and the author of a stunningly controversial recent piece in The New Yorker called Change the World. George, welcome to TechCrunch TV.
Good to be with you.
George, you've written this remarkable book called The Unwinding about America, and it seems to me you've put, in some ways, Silicon Valley at the center of all the changes and problems with the new America. Is that fair?
I don't think that's quite right. I've put Silicon Valley in the context of the rest of the country, which doesn't always happen, and how America's changed over the past generation from powerful places like Silicon Valley and Washington and Wall Street to forgotten places like Youngstown, Ohio and rural North Carolina and the Tampa Bay exurbs, to see them all together as part of the same story rather than as these separate worlds, which is how they're often written about. And I think Silicon Valley has been maybe the signal success story over that period of time.
So what is that story, George? In your book, you make Peter Thiel one of the central characters in your narrative. Why did you choose Thiel? And what is the relationship in the story between Silicon Valley and the collapse, the economic and cultural collapse in places like Florida and the Midwest?
I wanted to write about Peter Thiel because he's one of the few people in Silicon Valley who is asking the basic question, how is it that the information revolution has changed life to such a dramatic degree? It's created a revolution of change in our lifestyles, the way we communicate, and created massive wealth for a certain number of people. And yet, at the same time, we've had economic stagnation and the decline of the middle class and a general sense that America has lost its way. How are those two things happening at the same time? And I'm not sure it's a question that people in Silicon Valley ask often enough, but Thiel does, and he has certain answers. And the answers aren't all convincing to me, but I'm interested in him because he's thinking about it, even though he himself has been staggeringly successful over the last 10 or 15 years. He still has a sense that it's not the country he expected it to be. It's not the country maybe that he anticipated living in when he was a boy growing up in Silicon Valley.
Well, George, you were a boy growing up in, I don't know if we would call it Silicon Valley. You grew up in,
called that.
Yeah, you grew up in Mountain View in a pre-Silicon Valley age.
Yeah.
And your New Yorker piece, Changed the World, reveals your disappointment with the way in which Silicon Valley has evolved. Is that fair?
I went back to just see what had changed since I was a kid. I left in 1978, which was really at the beginning, the dawn of the personal computer and how it revolutionized our lives. And also, it was the year that Proposition 13 passed, which began the erosion of schools and public institutions in California. So those two things were happening right at the same time. And my book, The Unwinding, begins in 1978 because I think a lot of important things started to happen right around then. And what I found coming back was, a kind of magical Oz where people were solving all kinds of problems, including problems that maybe didn't need to be solved, and were getting very rich doing it, and were intensely inwardly focused on their companies and on the culture of Silicon Valley. And it seemed, in some ways, as far away from Rockingham County, North Carolina, as Burma. It just struck me, as I'm often struck these days, at how different and unequal Americans' lives are. In Silicon Valley, it's just everything feels nice in Silicon Valley. The weather is nice, the cars are nice, people are nice.
Was it nice when you were growing up?
It was nice in a different way. It was much simpler. I mean, there was money, but not fantastic wealth. There was a rough, equal middle class. Everyone went to public school that I knew. The only people who went to private school had screwed up in public school. People's houses weren't all that big. It was, I don't want to romanticize it too much because we do that when we turn 50.
You're not 50, George, are you?
I am 52, I'm sorry to say.
But seriously, George, in your piece, and this has been quoted endlessly on tech blogs, you make the point that a lot of the products that are now being developed in Silicon Valley reflect a certain kind of interest of privileged 20-year-olds. Could you say something more about that?
That was a bit of a throwaway quip, although I stand by it, that occurred to me when I was thinking about all the startups that I heard about and saw, especially south of Market in San Francisco, where it seemed less about big engineering efforts and more about smaller design, software design companies. Yeah, Airbnb and Uber and Lyft and, Seamless and these apps and companies that seemed all about making life as pleasant and frictionless and sort of adventurous in a safe way as possible. I was trying to imagine, how I would use them regularly in my life, with small kids and, just other concerns. And it suddenly I had this moment of thinking, actually, that it was something having to do with the people who are designing.
So this has really hit home, George, and a lot of people have picked up on this point. But you're on TechCrunch TV now. Well, what needs to change? It's all very well critiquing Silicon Valley, and I think even some of the most excited entrepreneurs would agree with some of the things you're saying. What needs to change to bring Silicon Valley back in sync with the rest of America, or perhaps to make the rest of America back in sync with Silicon Valley?
I'd say either one of two things. Either get back to the roots of Silicon Valley, which is to say really daring, adventurous, and profound technological advances.
You sound like Peter Thiel here.
Yeah, I think Peter's half right. I just don't think we're ever going to cure death or establish good societies offshore, and I don't want our artificial intelligence to supersede human beings. But Peter's half right, and either that or scale down sort of the self-regard of Silicon Valley. It really isn't a revolution.
Self-regard?
Yeah, a little bit.
What do you mean, George? You mean arrogant young kids thinking they're the center of the world?
Yeah, and thinking that Facebook, is changing the world. It's a cliche now. I hear it everywhere. That was something that struck me in Silicon Valley, how easily and casually that phrase was used. They're changing the world and they're not. They're soaking up a lot of people's time and money. I'm not sure they're improving life greatly across the board and across borders. So scale it down and just see yourselves. The industry should see itself as an industry among many industries. One of the better ones, maybe one of the best, but still, it has its interests. It has its narrow focus. It's going to collide with the public interest often, as it's doing right now with the NSA story, and will continue to do with privacy issues and monopoly issues, and be, sort of step down and become part of the larger society rather than this magical realm that is separate from America and wants to revolutionize it without necessarily getting its hands dirty in our politics.
So is this a cultural change? You're just telling these kids to grow up? What actually has to happen here for that thing to happen?
I think, I wrote about this new group Forward.us, this advocacy group. And
the Zuckerberg green thing.
Yeah, and it had a rough start, but I think it's a step in the right direction, because it seemed to me like here is Silicon Valley using its money and its influence to press a very particular policy issue, and to do it out in the open, and not to think that your business is changing the world and that's all that needs to happen, because it doesn't. The business is a business. Silicon Valley is a group of very wealthy individuals and powerful corporations. We've seen that many times before in American history, and eventually those run up against broader interests. And for that to be clear, I guess clear-eyed seeing Silicon Valley clearly is what I would ask. To not have illusions about the harmony of Silicon Valley's interests and the interests of all the rest of us, because they're not always going to be in harmony.
Well, there you have it. George Packer, the author, the distinguished author of The Unwinding, telling Silicon Valley via Skype, ironically, to look more clearly at the world, be more honest. George, it's a real honor to have you on TechCrunch TV. And I hope you'll come back on again soon and tell me if you think Silicon Valley is indeed growing up. Thank you so much.
I will. I like talking to people in Silicon Valley.